Democracy depends on a free press. Please support our independent journalism at democracynow.org/give. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez in Chicago. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
President Trump has arrived in Qatar after 2 days in Saudi Arabia. Earlier today, President Trump met in Riyadh with Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, the former al-Qaeda leader who helped topple the regime of Bashar al-Assad last December. During the meeting, Trump urged al-Sharaa to normalize ties with Israel and join the Abraham Accords. Trump also asked the Syrian leader to deport Palestinians he described as, quote, terrorists. After the meeting, Trump said, quote, we're currently exploring normalizing relations with Syria's new government, unquote. The meeting took place hours after Trump pledged to lift U.S. sanctions on Syria in a major policy shift.
In Syria, which has seen so much misery and death, there is a new government that will hopefully succeed in stabilizing the country and keeping peace. That's why my administration has already taken the first steps toward restoring normal relations between the United States and Syria for the first time in more than a decade. I will be ordering the cessation of sanctions against Syria in order to give them a chance at greatness.
Much of President Trump's trip to the Gulf has focused on securing new deals for U.S. companies. On Tuesday, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia signed a new $142 billion arms deal in what the White House has called the largest defense cooperation agreement Washington has ever achieved. Trump claims Saudi Arabia has pledged to invest $1 trillion in the United States.
And with this trip, we're adding over $1 trillion more in terms of investment into our country and buying our products. And, you know, nobody makes military equipment like us. We have the best military equipment, the best missiles, the best rockets, the best everything, best submarines, by the way.
President Trump is now in Qatar and then will head to the United Arab Emirates. He's facing increasing bipartisan criticism over reports that Qatar's preparing to give him a $400 million luxury plane known as the Flying Palace. We're joined now by two guests. In Washington, D.C., Akbar Shahid Ahmed, the senior diplomatic correspondent for HuffPost, is with us. His latest piece is headlined "A Moment of Truth in the Middle East for Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff." His forthcoming book on the Biden administration in Gaza is titled "Crossing the Red Line." And here in New York, Sarah Leah Whitson is with us, the executive director of Dawn, an organization working to reform U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. We welcome you both back to Democracy Now! Sarah Leah Whitson, let's begin with you. Your assessment of what's happened over the last 2 days, both his visits with these three countries, he's about to go to the United Arab Emirates, just landed in Qatar and Doha, but also what this means for Israel.
Well, this is a very volatile moment in the Middle East, and we've seen some pivots that we really haven't seen for decades in terms of independent U.S. decision-making in the Middle East. President Trump has ended sanctions on Syria. He's reached a truce in Yemen with the Houthis. He's declared that he's going to have diplomatic negotiations with Iran, all without the consent or veto of Israel, which previously existed. And meanwhile, he's dramatically expanding America's economic ties to the Gulf states, declaring that if you can pay, then you can play. The massive announcement of trade deals with Saudi Arabia, $600 billion, the largest weapons deal, $148 billion with Saudi Arabia, and really no talk at all of a normalization with Israel as any kind of a condition, including for the development of a civilian nuclear plant. What we still don't know is what Saudi's going to charge the United States in return, whether there's going to be a defense pact, which is, of course, what Saudi Arabia has long been looking for.
And Sarah, what about all of the CEOs of major U.S. corporations that have also headed to the Middle East as well for during these days? What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, the days of Saudi isolation in the wake of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, when some of these very same business leaders absented themselves from appearing in Saudi Arabia, are long over. And now I think American companies are looking to cash in on the billions of dollars of the Saudi Public Investment Fund, the Emirati Public Investment Fund, the Qatari Public Investment Fund. This is a boondoggle for American businesses because the Gulf states understand that in order to continue to secure U.S. protection, they must expand their investments in U.S. businesses.
And in terms of the ceasefire in Yemen that Trump has implemented, as well as other actions he's taken that seem to be marginalizing Israel and the Netanyahu administration, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, the ceasefire with the Yemen and the Houthis is an excellent development, and I wish that every other American president had ended failed catastrophic wars after a mere 2 months, which is the deadline that President Trump imposed on this foolish incursion into Yemen, which has put us back exactly where we were before the incursion started. This was never a conflict that the United States was pursuing in U.S. interests, but clearly to support Israel and to protect Israel. I think it's a very important signal that President Trump is now making decisions that more closely align with U.S. interests than with Israel's interests. I think it's very notable that the Houthis launched an attack on Israel a mere day after this ceasefire was announced, making clear, underlining really, that the ceasefire does not include sustaining or suspending attacks on Israel.
Akbar Shahid Ahmed, you've written an extensive piece about the meaning of this trip. And again, at this point of this broadcast, President Trump's landed in Doha, but he just met with the Syrian president and said they're dropping all sanctions against Syria, which also includes, presumably, against he himself, against the Syrian president. If you can talk about the significance of this moment and what you thought was most significant in the meetings in Saudi Arabia with the Crown Prince and the investment, a massive meeting of hundreds of CEOs. You see Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman sitting right next to Elon Musk.
Right, Amy. But with the meeting with President Shara, which is the first meeting between an American president and a Syrian president in more than 2 decades, that's a real signal that Trump, as Sarah Leah said, is pursuing a policy that's a little different than what the Israelis certainly would like. This is the culmination of a months-long battle within Trump's own administration that I've been reporting on, where there are still many neoconservatives, kind of pro-Israel hardliners, the folks who've been in the Republican ecosystem for many, many years, who were not supportive of this kind of policy on Syria. So for President Trump to be in Saudi Arabia, publicly embracing the Syrian president, not just saying hello, which is what the White House told us he was going to do yesterday, he actually had a more extensive conversation and has expressed a lot of hopes for U.S.-Syria engagement. I think that's quite striking, right? It's certainly showing you a U.S. approach that, as some regional sources have described to me, they see as more even-handed because they believe now, rather than under the Biden administration, certainly, but even administrations before that, there was a U.S. policy very much conceived not just in coordination with Israel, but often shaped by an assumption about how Israel would react, right? Which was kind of shaping how officials were having even internal conversations. I will hazard, though, I think what's really significant to remember is who's not being talked about. There was also some chatter that Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas might come to Saudi Arabia. That didn't happen, right? And so even while President Trump is in Saudi, is making these conversations about peace between the U.S. and Syria, Syria and Israel, Gaza is still being pummeled. And we were still seeing a blockade of more than 70 days there, where 1 in 5 Gazans is facing extreme starvation. There hasn't been food, there hasn't been fuel, there hasn't been medicine, and all of that is backed by the U.S. So President Trump is putting forward this image that, yes, I'm not necessarily aligning with Israel at all times. At the same time, he's making significant concessions and approvals to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan to continue the war, continue pummeling Palestinians.
And Akbar, what do you make? There's been a lot of press attention to this donation of the royal family of Qatar of a $400 million luxury 747 plane to President Trump or to the United States. What's your take on this?
I think, one, it's going to be a really serious wrinkle in President Trump's attempt at diplomacy. A lot of what he's trying to do, whether it's weapons sales, whether it's a potential defense treaty with Saudi Arabia, does have to go through Congress. I think this is going to become a significant issue. Democrats are going to latch onto this, claiming corruption, and some Republicans are already uncomfortable with it. I think the concern about this is not just about an ethical appearance of taking a gift from the Qataris, which has its own concerns. It's also about policy making and real strategic danger. When I've been talking to regional officials, Western officials, U.S. officials, they're saying, look, Trump's deal-making approach is part of why he kind of plays so well with these Arab states that are very transactional, don't want to hear moralistic rhetoric about human rights, or even long-term strategy. They want to just pay to play, as Sarah Leah put it. But does that lead to just short-term wins, right? Or does that lead to the personal and private mixing in ways where President Trump can walk away saying, I feel great, I got this plane, and maybe I've got some deals. What's the long-term strategic danger there? You know, and a lot of my reporting on Trump and his envoy to the region, Steve Witkoff, has focused on how they're pursuing really unconventional, really personalistic dealings with these leaders. In one instance, the leader of the United Arab Emirates, Steve Witkoff, who's Trump's envoy, had a 10-hour meeting with him where he didn't tell any other U.S. officials what was discussed. So that kind of policy-making process, I think, is the risk behind this extreme, personalized, and potentially corrupt relationship.
I mean, Akbar, I wanted you to talk more about who Steve Witkoff is. I mean, this trip started before President Trump got on the plane to Saudi Arabia, right? It started with Adnan Alexander, the Israeli-American hostage, who Israel didn't negotiate to get him out. The U.S. negotiated directly, presumably with Witkoff, with Hamas to get him out. And he didn't meet with Netanyahu, and he's coming to the United States. The significance of this complete sidelining, icing out of Israel that began before Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely, Amy. Witkoff has been the man shaping the region, not just since January when Trump took office, but to a large extent in November and December, in those waning months of the Biden administration. Witkoff was the person who really negotiated that Gaza ceasefire that did last from January to March. Since then is when you've seen the beginning of the sidelining you talk about. Based on my sources, I've understood that Witkoff has actually personally told people he felt played by Netanyahu because it was Israel that broke the ceasefire, went back into Gaza, and really undercut what Witkoff and, by extension, President Trump were trying to do. So this kind of sense of we don't have to coordinate with the Israelis is very much linked to Witkoff's view that he is a personally empowered envoy of Trump. He's a personal friend of Trump's. And importantly, he's personally wealthy and he's not political, right? So compared to, say, U.S. officials in previous administrations, or even in this one, he's not someone who's looking at how do I advance international security establishment for years to come? How does challenging Israel potentially put me at risk? And so that's something where talking to a lot of regional officials, U.S. officials, they feel he is able to be a little more even-handed and a little less driven by a fixation on Israel. But I think that also puts him in the crosshairs of a lot of the pro-Israel kind of advocacy ecosystem that does exist, right? And we've seen that come out. Already there's been a lot of attacks on Witkoff personally, his business ties with Qatar, his potentially, unconventional tactics. But Witkoff very much has the trust of the president personally, and I discovered this kind of reporting on him, taking criticisms to the White House. They are ardently supporting him, and importantly, not just kind of lower-level officials, really high-ranking people like Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, and Vice President J.D. Vance are pushing Witkoff as an avatar almost of what they describe as a different kind of Trump foreign policy, saying we are promoting a foreign policy that will bring peace to the region. Really important to remember that foreign policy, of course, involves, as I said, continued pummeling of Gaza and huge weapons deals to regimes that have pursued huge wars. But it is one that isn't necessarily being driven by intense U.S. military entanglement, particularly with Israel. And I think that pattern will continue. You'll see that mostly play out in the next few weeks. I think there's a looming deadline and fight over Iran diplomacy, which Steve Witkoff, the president's envoy, is also leading. Again, very controversial for Israel, very controversial for national security hawks. I think there'll be a really intense kind of battle over what Witkoff is willing to do with Iran.
And Akbar, I wanted to follow that up on Iran. The willingness of President Trump to engage in negotiations over uranium enrichment with Iran. I'm sure that Netanyahu and the current Israeli government is not happy with this.
They're certainly not thrilled one. Their preference would have been for a U.S. and Israeli-backed military strike by now, in fact, prior to now. Their argument is we as Israel, in this kind of post-October 7th moment in our retaliatory campaign across the region, have weakened Iran, right? They've weakened the pro-Iran militia in Lebanon, Hezbollah. They've, in fact, even weakened Iran's own air defenses. So the argument from Netanyahu and his government is, let us use this moment to take a strike against Iran, knock it out for good. The counter-argument to that is, of course, unintended consequences of a major war, and also that technical nuclear expertise doesn't go away. So the Trump administration is saying, let's try to reach a deal, and they have stuck by that despite facing criticism. What's kind of unclear still is how much expertise they'll develop. These are very hard deals to negotiate. It's worth remembering President Trump is in this situation because he abandoned a deal that the Obama administration had achieved, right, through extreme negotiation and technical expertise. The Trump team hasn't yet shown they kind of have that level of professionalism, and also they haven't really made clear how much they're willing to give up to Iran. Iran, given that it felt burned by the U.S., which did abandon the previous nuclear deal, which Iran was complying with, Iran has said, we want a little more. We want more guarantees to know this will be permanent. This will bring us the sanctions relief in exchange for nuclear limitations. And I think the Trump administration needs to kind of demonstrate that, especially in the weeks ahead. There is a looming deadline, again, because there are UN sanctions on Iran that will go back into place starting in July. So if there isn't some kind of temporary deal by then, all of this diplomacy by the Trump administration will get much, much harder and less likely to deliver.
So continuing on Iran, Sarah Leah Whitson, a few days ago, this whole idea being floated, this is a piece from the New York Times, can Trump rename the Persian Gulf? His suggestion to call the body of water the Arabian Gulf has apparently done the impossible, unite Iranians. But if you can talk further about what this means for U.S.-Iran relations, but then also let's go back to Qatar and talk more about what exactly Qatar wants at this point. I wanted to bring in that clip. It's like 3 seconds of Trump defending taking that $400 million flying palace. This is what he said to a reporter.
It's not a gift to me. It's a gift to the Department of Defense.
It's not a gift to me. It's a gift to the Department of Defense. And, of course, when he leaves, it's going to go to him or to go to the Trump Presidential Library, which means the U.S. will pour in hundreds of millions of dollars to refurbish it. But then it goes to Trump, and these new Boeing planes supposedly will be the new U.S. Air Force One. But what Qatar wants from this, and so first Iran, then Qatar.
Well, with Iran, obviously, President Trump made clear, even when he was a candidate, that his goal was to reach a deal with Iran. And he even talked about lifting sanctions on Iran, which, interestingly, Kamala Harris criticized and condemned. So I think Trump has made clear his willingness to engage in negotiations with Iran to lift sanctions, to reach a nuclear deal from the get-go. I think Israel assumed they would be able to curb that and instead get war on Iran. That's failed. Very interestingly, Iran has just proposed a joint nuclear development, uranium enrichment with the UAE and with Saudi Arabia, something that would have been unthinkable, but would certainly sweeten the consideration of what could be a civilian power, nuclear power for the entire region, and brings these countries closer together. And I think that's a good thing. Anything that reduces the temperature of war in this region is a good thing. happening. In terms of Qatar, Qatar depends on the United States for military protection. This $400 million plane is protection money, and it's directly protection money to Trump. But I don't think, even though the glaring flying machine that is an advertisement for Qatar is particularly glaring, I don't think we can take it out of the context of massive foreign influence, expanding foreign influence, the purchase of influence with money, with Gulf money. We have long had a U.S. foreign policy that has been controlled by money, including in particular pro-Israel money that has seeped into American politics, Democrats and Republicans, and now the Gulf states are in on the game more crudely and nakedly than ever before, as this plane signifies, and they're certainly outspending AIPAC, which is something that's making AIPAC and the pro-Israel supporters panic. But this, I think, represents the most glaring example of what has become the corruption of the U.S. political system, not just by domestic lobbying interests, but by foreign lobbying interests. So I think, in fact, all of this is quite depressing and disheartening because they are predicated on short-term gains, short-term financial gains, not just for President Trump, but for the entire establishment.
And Sarah, I wanted to ask you about Saudi Arabia. In a departure from his previous stance, Trump has suggested that Saudi Arabia will join the so-called Abraham Accords and forge relations with Israel, quote, in its own time. The significance of this?
Well, the significance of this is that Trump has successfully delinked both the development of a civilian nuclear plant as well as this new trade deal, and I'm expecting a defense agreement, a defense cooperation agreement that will come from any normalization with Israel, whereas Biden had suggested that all of these things would be dependent on Saudi Arabia normalizing with Israel. That's off the table, but it's important to note that it's off the table because of Israel's own self-sabotage. It was really only Netanyahu and Israel who are the primary reasons there is no normalization with Saudi Arabia right now. And the Trump administration has now clearly indicated that they are going to proceed on their business arrangements and military arrangements with Saudi Arabia, regardless of its normalization with Israel. This is one of the greatest acts of political self-sabotage that we've seen in the region for a while, and it's pretty remarkable how close Israel was to normalizing with Saudi Arabia, but torpedoed that with its own fanatical, maniacal obsession with its genocide in Gaza.
President Trump, in talking to Bob Woodward, talked about how he saved the rhymes with glass of Mohammed bin Salman when it came to Khashoggi. You mentioned Khashoggi at the beginning, the founder of Dawn, your organization. But for people who may not remember what happened, if you can talk about that and the significance of Trump's very close relationship with the Crown Prince now, even as he said to Bob Woodward, I saved that, guys.
Well, that was a rare moment of clarity and honesty from President Trump, telling us, letting us know how he saved Mohammed bin Salman from global accountability, from judicial accountability, from complete ostracism with his crime that shook the world, which was the targeted kidnapping and assassination of a U.S. resident, Jamal Khashoggi, who had been writing critical columns about Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, in the Washington Post, but also founding and launching an organization that was aimed at reshaping U.S. policy with Saudi Arabia in the region, promoting democracy and human rights in the region. After this murder, I mean, we know that the CIA was surveilling the WhatsApp communications between Mohammed bin Salman and his primary henchman, Saud al-Qahtani, both before, during, and after the murder of Khashoggi at the Istanbul consulate, the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and he was caught red-handed. The Biden administration revealed and released the CIA's assessment that, in fact, Mohammed bin Salman ordered the murder of Khashoggi, but of course, Biden capitulated on every front, going so far as to grant Mohammed bin Salman immunity from prosecution, though he is not the head of state of Saudi Arabia, because King Salman is still the head of state. So there was a complete pivot by the Biden administration, originally promising accountability for Saudi Arabia and then transforming into the fist bump and close ties with Saudi Arabia. So this is something that President Trump continues to have and hold over Mohammed bin Salman's head. They can release those messages showing Mohammed bin Salman's complicity in the murder of Khashoggi. I'm sure there are other secrets of Mohammed bin Salman's that the United States and the CIA has and will continue to lord over him. But right now, President Trump is focused on deal-making with Mohammed bin Salman.
Where's Khashoggi's body?
We don't know. One would think that at minimum...
killed in the Istanbul embassy.
Killed in the Istanbul embassy, reportedly either burned. The consulate of Saudi Arabia in Istanbul, reportedly his remains may have been disposed of in an incinerator at the premises or removed out of the premises and taken to a car wash to be disposed of. We don't really know. Saudi Arabia has never told us what they did with Jamal's remains. One would think they would have the dignity and respect to at least allow this man to have a proper burial, but that is not something we can hope for. And I want to remind people that Mohammed bin Salman may seem a little bit reasonable right now amidst really the complete insanity of Israel in terms of the genocide in Gaza, but Mohammed bin Salman himself is a volatile, unpredictable, sociopath who continues to detain and imprison the mildest of critics in his country, who continued a 7-year senseless war in Yemen, resulting in over 300,000 deaths. And of course, not only did he murder Jamal Khashoggi in cold blood, but targeted and attempted to kill several other critics of his regime who live abroad, including in the United Kingdom, including in Canada, opening up really a field day of efforts of targeted assassinations.
And Sarah, I wanted to ask you, the prospect of a Saudi-U.S. security agreement with, as you mentioned, the leader that Saudi Arabia has right now, the Crown Prince. The significance of it, and why does Saudi Arabia even need it, given the close alliance it already has with the U.S.?
Right. So Saudi Arabia has been demanding a bilateral security agreement, treaty-level guarantees and protection from the United States for a while, basically to immunize themselves from the herky-jerky of a new administration that comes in threatening to reshape its ties to Saudi Arabia. And remember, President Biden said he was going to cut all military sales to Saudi Arabia in the wake of its atrocities in Yemen and the murder of Khashoggi. So they want to immunize themselves from the back and forth of U.S. politics by having this defense agreement. Interestingly, the White House's announcement of its meetings in Saudi Arabia, the $600 billion in promised investments, which let's see whether or not they materialize and how quickly they materialize, had no mention of a security agreement, no mention of U.S. security commitments to Saudi Arabia. I'm pretty certain that these things are going to come. I don't think Saudi Arabia is going to allow the United States to develop this civilian nuclear plant for free. China has been willing to do it, and they've been willing to offer the deal to China. Saudi Arabia wants something back, and it remains what the United States has to offer it, which is military and political protection.
We just have 30 seconds, but Akbar Shahid Ahmed, I want to end where we started today's show with our headlines, and that is in Gaza. The horror that is taking place there, the intensification of Israel's attacks right now on Gaza, the starvation, the killings, the airstrikes, and you're writing a book on what's happened in Gaza. Your final thoughts on where this could all lead? I mean, if President Trump, the number of negotiations he's engaged with, coming to a ceasefire between India and Pakistan, with the Houthis recognizing Syria, if he stopped arms sales to Israel right now, there would have to be a ceasefire, because Netanyahu could not proceed without those weapons.
I think, Amy, there's some hope of that, but fundamentally, I think it's so important to remember that President Trump has shown a really clear antipathy towards Palestinians fundamentally, right? These are not people who have something to offer him the same way that wealthy Gulf Arabs or others in the region do, or Iran, through a kind of preventing a war lens. So I think that while there's some hope and expectation of that, my conversations with people talking to the White House, hoping for something meaningful on Gaza, it's pretty low right now. I think there's a sense that there might be a fig leaf, something that says, here's a U.S. plan to stop the fighting for a while, but that would really involve a really kind of pro-Israeli approach that humanitarian organizations are really worried about, would not necessarily help actual aid reach Gazans, and I think could very easily fall apart. So right now, there doesn't seem to be that interest and that deep expertise to deliver for Gaza, even though President Trump has this desire to be a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. But that may change, like everything in this administration, of course.
Akbar Shahid Ahmed, we want to thank you for being with us, HuffPost senior diplomatic correspondent, speaking to us from D.C. And thank you to Sarah Leah Whitson, the executive director of Dawn. Democracy Now! Is funded by viewers like you. Please give today at democracynow.org/give.